What up, y'all? This is my memoir series, number 5, I think. Number 5. I don't know what total video number this is. I should have looked that up before I started, but I don't know. But today, anyways, I want to talk about something. I flipped a coin. I have a system of how I decide what memoir I'm going to talk about today. And I flipped a coin, and turns out what I'm going to talk about is the long lived and frustrating and absurd conversation between the comparisons, but definitely the contrasts of the Ku Klux Klan versus Black Lives Matter. So this may not be as timely as it could have been when I had this conversation with someone, but I didn't have the idea to do this memoir series until years later, and here I am. But let's get into it. So this conversation, argument, debate, what have you, happened during the candidacy of now President Donald Trump. But this is during the time where he was just a candidate running against Hillary Clinton. And this was the time, I believe, it was after Charlottesville, Virginia, and the violence that happened there. And this was the time of Richard Spencer's kind of 15 minutes of fame, the attempted re-rise of David Duke, and Charlottesville. The alt-right publicity that happened in the early 2018, 2017, 2018-ish era. So I shared an article on Facebook about how Trump, of course, we all know, if you were alive then, you probably saw it because it was big news, about how President Donald Trump did not denounce the individuals in Charlottesville. And I know there are probably going to be people in the comments saying, well, he did denounce them. Well, his words were, there were very fine people on both sides. So he didn't, and he never ever really flat out, at least publicly, at least in a press release, maybe in some writings in the background or an official document or what have you, or official statement, but nothing publicly for the media to see where he denounced David Duke, Richard Spencer, the Klan, the alt-right, all these people supporting him. He never denounced it. And so me, coming from a policy background, academically at least, not in practice as of yet, but academically, coming from a political science, policy, civics background, I was very honest about my views, but I also was keeping it very, as horrible as it sounds, logically, as far as what his mind was. And I simply made a post to the liking of, well, he's not going to denounce his voters. Those are the people who supported him. Those are the people who had his vote, or who he had their vote. Those are the people rallying for him. I'm not saying, and I never said, and this was my whole contention in this argument, I never said that everybody who was supported him was an alt-right or a Klansman or something of that nature. I just said that demographic that those people were voting for him, were leaning towards him, which is true. The alt-right and the Ku Klux Klan and similar organizations were supporting him. He was gaining support from them, right? So a young lady replies under my post saying something to the effect of, because my post was that he's not going to denounce his voters. She said, well, I don't recall Obama denouncing Black Lives Matter. Well, here it comes. Okay, so let me start out first and foremost by reiterating and emphasizing that Black Lives Matter is in no way, shape, or form anywhere comparable to the Ku Klux Klan or the alt-right or any white supremacist militia. Nowhere near comparable. Comparison should never be in the argument, the vocabulary. Black Lives Matter, KKK, and comparison should never be three words found in the same sentence. So let's get that out of the way. So, this was 2 years ago, 1 or 2 years ago, so I don't quite remember each and every comment that was being made. But her contention was that because of the violence of a few people who claimed to be members, and I put that in quotations because this is going to be very important, who claimed to be members of Black Lives Matter, or who portrayed Black Lives Matter in some way, shape, or form when they were committing these acts against people of color, against white individuals. They were committing violence. Her contention was that Black Lives Matter is a violent organization. So here's the thing about that. And before I get to my contention about the KKK, I just want to address something. Black Lives Matter, at least then, I'm not too sure now, but I do know for sure then, which is just a couple years ago, did not have an official membership system. Did not have an official membership system. So you cannot, in effect, be a member, a registered member of Black Lives Matter. Now, there may be people who align with Black Lives Matter, and there may be people who portray themselves as Black Lives Matter, and there may be people who are active in their chapter. But I can guarantee you that there's no official membership. And I want to say this. The people that committed violence in the name of Black Lives Matter, if you know anything about Black Lives Matter, did not share in the values of Black Lives Matter. So one, that denounces that young lady's contention. Not to mention the membership aspect of it, because there is no membership. So you can't represent Black Lives Matter in any way, shape, or form unless you are the founders. So, I say that to say that when you go to a Black Lives Matter protest or a function or a meeting, there are no official members of Black Lives Matter. There are just people who believe in the mission, believe in the phrase, the buzz phrase, whatever you want to call it, believe in the statement that Black Lives Matter, and they are protesting for the equity of marginalized groups, especially black people. So, when you stand next to someone in solidarity, not everyone there, especially since a protest is usually public And since Black Lives Matter, it's usually word of mouth or advertised as open to the public. And if you align with the views, you may go and protest with them. And honestly, even if you don't align with their views, you are within your constitutional right to have a counter protest. Now, I say that to say, when someone is on the Black Lives Matter side, and I literally mean side, because usually counter protests are parallel. So let's just say, for the sake of argument, there is a Black Lives Matter side and an alt-right / KKK / neo-Nazi / white supremacist side. If you're on the Black Lives Matter side, usually, because it's not a exclusive membership group, you're going to have people of all backgrounds, races, creeds, groups there on that Black Lives Matter side. And sometimes some people are not nonviolent, and sometimes they may commit violent acts. A lot of anti-Black Lives Matter people or all lives matter people will use Ferguson as an example. But the thing about that is that the Black Lives Matter protesters have a lot more agency individually. They're not representing the organization that is Black Lives Matter because, again, there is no official membership to Black Lives Matter. They are simply individuals of their own agency protesting for an ideology they believe in. So one, they can't represent Black Lives Matter, and they're just not representing Black Lives Matter. They're representing their own violent actions. Whether warranted or unwarranted is an argument for another day, but they're representing their own violent actions. That's not held to the responsibility of Black Lives Matter. And I say this to say, because when you're on a Black Lives Matter side, you don't know who you're standing with, what their motives are, what their intentions are, or what type of person they are. You just assume or infer that they are there to have a nonviolent protest because y'all both believe in something, essentially that Black Lives Matter or that equity for marginalized people or black people is something that needs to be happening in this country. Therefore, you stand on that side. I say that to say, because this is very, very important, and this is something that no one ever admits, whether they're an All Lives Matter sympathizer, or if they're an alt-right sympathizer, or a Ku Klux Klansman, or neo-Nazi, whatever. The reason, the difference in the dynamic is that each of those organizations on the opposite side, neo-Nazi, alt-right, Ku Klux Klan. Now, alt-right is a little bit shady and trickier, but but Ku Klux Klan and militias, neo-Nazis, those are membership programs. And even if they weren't, you know what that group stands for. One, because it's usually in their statements or their constitution or their mission statements. There's record, or you know their history. So I say that because you cannot assume that the very few people who have committed violence in the name of Black Lives Matter, you can't assume that therefore Black Lives Matter is a violent organization. Because one, there again, no membership. Two, Black Lives Matter has zero history as an organization, as various chapters or charters of being violent, and nowhere in their constitution, in any specific documents, do they advocate for violence. However, neo-Nazis, the Ku Klux Klan, alt-right do. They have a history, and it's in their official documentation that they advocate for violence, either in coded words, or for some chapters it's outright violence. And I say that to say is because for someone to sympathize with them, or for someone to stand on that side, they know what that group is about. They know the intent of that group. It's not simply just ideology. It's not simply just a request of the status quo to be the same. That is, whites here, blacks here. Well, it's really more like whites here, blacks here. But when someone stands next to a Ku Klux Klansman, a neo-Nazi, a alt-righter, they know, or they should know, exactly what that group stands for. They stand for violence, nationalism, white supremacy, and all those things that come with it, whether coded or not. They know. This is why the Ku Klux Klan and similar organizations should be regarded as terrorist organizations, should be regarded as violent organizations, should be regarded as all that synonymous, dangerous. Whereas Black Lives Matter, there is no history of violence. There is a history of violence officially from Black Lives Matter. There's no documentation, constitution or otherwise, of violence, of black supremacy, of nationalism. There's nothing of the sort. And because Black Lives Matter is an affirming and welcoming organization in which people of all creeds and ideologies are allowed to protest on their side, because I shouldn't say all creeds and ideologies, but of similar creeds and ideologies, or who are in the fight of equity for people of color, they're allowed to be on that Black Lives Matter side. And people look at Ferguson and individuals who are not representing Black Lives Matter, they see their acts of violence and assume it's all Black Lives Matter. But that's not the case, because there's no linkage to that violence to Black Lives Matter. Charlottesville, there is complete linkage to alt-right, neo-Nazi, Ku Klux Klan, and what happened in Charlottesville, because that's their MO. It's documented in their official documents that that's what they do. That's what they're willing to do. There's no way, shape, or form any evidence of that in Black Lives Matter. So, long-winded way of simply saying that there is no comparison whatsoever between the Ku Klux Klan and Black Lives Matter. Black Lives Matter, in and of itself, is a non-violent, legislation-changing, fight for equity organization, whereas the other side, Ku Klux Klan, neo-Nazi, alt-right, or for white nationalism, or coded as Eurocentric nationalism, or whatever it is Richard Spencer says about Europe. They advocate for violence against those who are not deemed as white. They advocate for violence. They advocate for marginalization. They advocate for they advocate for eradication. All of these things. That's their MO. So if they were to do something like Ferguson, that makes complete sense. And you cannot say that's just an individual. Why? Because when you stand next to and protest with a Klansman, or with Richard Spencer, or with a neo-Nazi, that is their MO. But if you stand next to someone in a BLM hoodie, or someone in a BLM wristband or a t-shirt, that's not their MO. And if they were to step out of line and commit violence, that's There's no comparison because that's individual. So yeah. Can't wait to see the comments on this one. That's going to be fun. I'm not arguing with any of y'all. Not going to do it. I said what I said. I'm not going to backtrack. So yeah. All right. That's it for today. Said my piece. That feels good because I've been wanting to say that for a long time. And you know, things are timely. You know, I decided to do this podcast. I decided to do this memoir series now, and so, you know, I feel good about it. All right, guys. Bye.